The dynamic self, how culture, family, and gender shape who we are. The self. The self is often described by certain traits. It is separate, self-contained, independent, consistent, unitary, and private. Separate. The self is distinct from others. Everyone is unique, even twins. Self-contained and independent. The self has its own thoughts and identity, able to exist on its own without relying on others. Consistent. A person's personality and traits stay mostly the same over time, making it possible to describe and measure. Unitary. The self is the center of a person's experiences, thoughts, and emotions. Private. The self processes emotions and thoughts internally, and no one else can fully access this. While the self is private, it also interacts with the external world, which shapes and influences it. This interaction highlights the social constructionist perspective. The self is dynamic and changes in response to society. It is not static but shaped by social experiences and constantly influenced by external forces. For example, consider John, a math professor, husband, father, and church volunteer. John's behavior changes based on his roles. He is serious at work, affectionate with his wife, stern with his kids, and friendly at church. These shifts show how the self adapts to different social situations. This flexibility is normal and expected, not hypocritical. The self constantly adjusts to its surroundings, reflecting its multifaceted nature. The self and culture. The idea that a person can remain the same while adapting to different contexts may seem contradictory. However, French anthropologist Marcel Mauss explains this with the concepts of moi and personne. Moi refers to a person's basic identity, including their sense of self and biological characteristics. It represents who a person fundamentally is. Personne encompasses the social roles and expectations associated with being who they are, shaped by family, culture, and other influences. In the example of John, he has a stable moi, but his personne shifts depending on the situation. He acts like a strict professor at work, a loving but firm father at home, and a playful husband with his wife, Joan. Even as he changes roles, he retains his core identity. This adaptability can also be seen cross-culturally. For instance, a Filipino overseas might ignore jaywalking rules at home but suddenly follow strict traffic laws in a country like Singapore. This change isn't always conscious. The self adjusts to fit the circumstances. Similarly, men may become sweet and caring when courting a woman, only to revert to their usual selves after getting a yes. Again, this transformation reflects how the self morphs based on context. Language plays a significant role in shaping the self. In Filipino, mahal kita means I love you, but it doesn't specify who loves whom. The word mahal means both love and expensive, indicating that love is linked to value. This differs from English, where love is seen more as a desire. Additionally, Filipino is gender neutral. The third-person pronoun is simply siya, with no distinction between male and female, unlike English or Spanish. This reflects cultural attitudes toward gender. These examples show how language is intertwined with culture, influencing how we view ourselves. Cultural differences affect self-perception. For instance, North Americans often emphasize their uniqueness, while Japanese people tend to be more modest. Thus, a person's self-concept is shaped by their cultural background and social environment. The self and the development of the social world. How do people shape their social world? How do children grow into social beings? How do twins, raised apart, turn out differently? While people have certain natural traits, they are actively involved in shaping themselves. It's not just about being born with specific characteristics. People grow and develop by interacting with the world around them. Language plays a key role in this process. It connects the individual with the social world, allowing them to shape and reshape each other. George Herbert Mead and Lev Vygotsky believe that humans develop through language and interaction. When people think or make decisions, they have an internal dialogue, asking themselves questions like, should I do this or that? Children, in particular, learn through role-playing and dialogues they encounter. Mead explains that as children play and take on roles, e.g., acting out scenes with toys, They begin to understand themselves and separate their identity from others. Vygotsky adds that children absorb the real life conversations they hear from parents, caregivers, and friends. This helps them solve problems and understand social and cultural norms. For example, kids might imitate their favorite cartoon characters like Dora, adopting their behaviors and speech patterns. In this way, children don't passively grow. They actively engage with and shape their social selves through language and interaction. Self in families. Lev Vygotsky emphasized that children internalize real-life conversations and interactions they have with their family, caregivers, and peers. These early exchanges help shape their thought processes and problem-solving skills, influencing their view of the world. For instance, children often mimic what they see in cartoons, like adopting behaviors from characters such as Dora the Explorer. From a sociological perspective, the family is central to understanding how the self develops within society. While children are born with certain genetic traits from their parents, it's the family environment, its values, support, and resources that profoundly shapes their growth. Human beings, unlike most animals, are born vulnerable and depend on their families for much longer. This extended period of dependency is critical to learning and developing a full sense of self. Families play a crucial role in teaching children how to navigate life and form their identity. Children observe and imitate their family's behaviors, learning language, social norms, and values through this process. For example, children raised in respectful households often grow up to be respectful individuals. This learning can be both conscious, such as being taught manners directly, or unconscious, like adopting a family member's tone of voice or emotional responses. If families fail to provide proper guidance, children may struggle with basic social skills or manners later in life. Without the support of a family, both biologically and socially, a person's survival and personal development are severely hindered. Consider the story of Tarzan. While he survived in the wild, his human development was incomplete because he lacked family interaction. This concept is also reflected in popular stories where babies are switched at birth and grow up with different families, illustrating how our sense of self is deeply influenced by the environment and upbringing we receive. In essence, who we become is significantly shaped by the family we are born into and the lessons we internalize from them. Our sense of identity, values, and behavior are all intricately tied to these early familial experiences. Gender and the self, a deeper exploration. Gender is a fundamental part of our identity, influencing not only how we see ourselves but also how society perceives and interacts with us. The concept of gender has evolved dramatically in recent decades, moving beyond the rigid binary of male and female to embrace a more fluid, diverse understanding. While some argue that gender is biologically determined and unchangeable, many social scientists, psychologists, and gender theorists suggest that gender is a socially constructed, evolving aspect of the self. This evolution reflects our freedom to explore, express, and define our gender identity as part of our broader selfhood. Gender as a dynamic concept. The traditional view of gender as fixed and biologically determined stems from the idea that biological sex, male or female, directly dictates one's gender identity, masculine or feminine. However, modern gender theory emphasizes the social construction of gender, arguing that gender identity is shaped by a combination of societal expectations, cultural influences, and personal experiences. This understanding allows for fluidity, the idea that gender can evolve over time and is not confined to a binary framework. Judith Butler, a leading gender theorist, introduced the concept of gender performativity, which suggests that gender is not something we are born with but something we perform based on societal norms. This performative nature of gender implies that individuals continuously do gender through their behavior, clothing, language, and interactions with others. Importantly, these performances are not fixed, meaning people can change how they express their gender over time, reflecting changes in their sense of self. Gender and self-perception, the case of Sonia Tolstoy. An example of how gender roles can shape self-perception comes from the life of Sonia Tolstoy, wife of the famous Russian writer Leo Tolstoy. Sonia's diary entries from her early years depict her as feeling trapped and unhappy in the role of a traditional wife and mother, duties that were socially prescribed to her at the time. She expressed frustration and feelings of insignificance, as if her worth was tied solely to her role as a caregiver and mother. However, a few years later, Sonia reflected on these earlier feelings with laughter, realizing that she was actually far happier than she had once perceived. This shift in her self-perception illustrates how deeply societal expectations, particularly those tied to gender roles, can shape our views of ourselves. In Sonia's case, her initial unhappiness stemmed from the cultural narrative that women should derive their fulfillment from motherhood and domestic duties. This shift also underscores that our understanding of our gender roles and self-worth can change over time as we reassess societal expectations and develop a more personal sense of identity. Gender in the Filipino cultural context. In many cultures, including the Philippines, traditional gender roles are deeply embedded and continue to shape people's lives. The expectations for men and women are distinct. Men are generally expected to be the family's providers, while women are seen as the primary caregivers, responsible for domestic tasks and nurturing the children. These traditional roles are reinforced by cultural practices, media representations, and family upbringing. In Filipino culture, this dynamic, girls, on the other hand, are raised to adopt feminine ideals which emphasize nurturing, caregiving, and emotional sensitivity. Feminist scholar Nancy Chodorow argues that because women have historically been the primary caregivers, girls often grow up modeling their behavior after their mothers. This reinforces traditional gender roles, as girls are socialized to value domestic work and caregiving responsibilities. Even the toys they are encouraged to play with, such as dolls and toy kitchens, prepare them for these roles, subtly embedding the idea that their primary value lies in homemaking and child-rearing. Patriarchal values and gender norms. Despite the strides made by feminist movements and LGBTQ+ advocacy, patriarchal values remain strong in many parts of the world. These values promote the idea that men are dominant and women are subordinate, creating a gender hierarchy that limits self-expression and self-discovery. In this framework, men are pressured to assert power and control, while women are expected to be submissive and nurturing. Rigid gender norms can stifle an individual's ability to explore their identity fully. People who don't conform to traditional gender expectations, such as transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming individuals, often face societal resistance, discrimination, and a lack of understanding. The enforcement of these norms can limit not only personal growth but also mental and emotional well-being. Gender fluidity and self-determination. In recent years, the fight for gender expression and the right to define one's identity has gained significant momentum. More individuals now embrace the idea that gender is not something dictated solely by biology but is a deeply personal part of who they are. People are increasingly rejecting traditional binary classifications, opting instead for non-binary or gender-fluid identities, where they may shift between masculine and feminine expressions or identify as neither. This personal discovery of gender is crucial to navigating society and forming a sense of self. For instance, a person assigned female at birth may later come to realize they identify as male or somewhere in between. The ability to express this identity freely is vital to their overall well-being, happiness, and sense of fulfillment. The psychological impact of gender identity. Research has shown that people who can freely express their gender identity are more likely to experience psychological well-being. Studies on transgender and gender nonconforming individuals, for example, have found that when they are supported in their gender identity, they show improved mental health outcomes, including lower levels of anxiety and depression. Conversely, people who face gender-based discrimination or are forced to conform to traditional gender roles often experience higher levels of psychological distress. The future of gender and the self. As society continues to evolve, so too will our understanding of gender and its role in shaping the self. The recognition that gender is fluid and not necessarily tied to biology opens up new possibilities for self-exploration and self-expression. Importantly, it challenges traditional notions of masculinity and femininity, offering individuals the freedom to construct their own identities. In conclusion, gender identity is a deeply personal aspect of selfhood that should not be confined by societal norms or cultural expectations. As we continue to fight for greater gender inclusivity, We create a world where individuals can fully embrace who they are, free from the constraints of rigid gender roles. Gender should not limit personal growth, but instead serve as a platform for people to explore their true selves, express their identities, and lead fulfilling, authentic lives.